Okay, this is like a big deal for me. Hatsy Cutshall, welcome back to the Nonprofit Show.
Thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure.
But what's more amazing is your role in YPTC, one of the leaders, and you are now taking over something really, really important, and that is that the federal government aspect of things. And so we're going to talk to you about this because there's so much change in such a short period of time that is pretty chaotic. So we've kind of tidied this up saying managing in uncertain times. But it's really, I almost want to change it to chaotic times. Um, and so we don't want to instill fear, but we want to be realistic today. And we want to really dig in. We are also always very realistic about the important place that our presenting sponsors have in our world. They include Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, Your Part-Time Controller, and Fundraisers Friday. I'm Julia C. Patrick, CEO of the American Nonprofit Academy. I have this amazing group of co-hosts. They come from all over the country. They do all different things in service of the nonprofit sector. They're just brilliant, riveting people. But I wanted Hatsy all to myself today, so I didn't schedule anyone on. So coming back to you, Harriet Hatsy Cutshall, Director of Government Awards Management at YPTC. That in itself is like a heady title. Talk to us about like what your role is, and then we'll go from there.
Well, my role as I wrote it was to support both clients and staff who are working with originally primarily government fund or federal funding is what we were thinking, but many state and local government grants lead to a lot of questions and challenges. So I'm here to support both my colleagues and our clients that are struggling with the many varied and seemingly ever-changing rules of working with government money at all levels. And the job description that I wrote originally was somewhat different than the one that I found myself in after Inauguration Day. But I'm having a great time through chaotic times.
Yeah, chaotic times. So let's just clarify this. I mean, YPTC, a national firm that works with nonprofits across this country. You are pretty much working in every single state of the union, and you have nearly 800 employees. So I would imagine that you are a resource, especially at this time, for if nothing else, just the team of YPTC. I mean, it's got to be pretty, frankly, daunting.
It is. And especially because so much is changing so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And many of our folks have worked with government money for years and years and years. So I'm certainly not the only one that can help my colleagues. But as we've grown, we've found we needed to formalize access to those resources. And as things are changing almost hourly some days now, I'm here along with my colleague Derek Dreyer, whom I believe you to before, and we formed a team to help colleagues and clients. I'm working with both who are looking for strategies on how to respond to everything from a stop work order to a news article.
Right. It's such an interesting time. And I've got to believe that, it's like a 24/7 thing because things are changing so quickly. And I want to start with some vocabulary because I think there are a lot of nonprofits who never thought they would be impacted by this because they're like, oh, well, we don't have federal contracts, but funders and contracts that you have federal, contracts. I mean, it kind of flows down. So if you will help us to understand what an EO and an OMB, what they represent, and then that way that will kind of frame up the rest of our conversation. Because I have a lot of questions for you, sister.
Okay. I'm ready to answer what I can. An EO is short for, it's an acronym. We're talking about Washington, so of course there are acronyms. And that's an executive order. And that is a written directive that can be made only by the President of the United States it is not legislation, but it has the force of legislation in many cases. And it's something that every president in history has issued, except one. William Henry Harrison, unfortunately, had a very short term, so he didn't write any. But the most famous EOs in history include the Emancipation Proclamation. That was an executive order, as was Truman's executive order to integrate the military. So these are not new.
Okay. Okay. I love that you put that framework around it, because, correct me if I'm wrong, with an executive order, an EO, this kind of kicks off all of this legal craziness, right? Like when an executive order is extended or submitted, whatever, presented, then that is the time with which all these different organizations, groups, people, businesses, sectors then go to court to try and get it stopped or halted. Is that correct? Is that fair to say?
That can happen if they're controversial, as so many of the recent ones have been. But so Congress cannot overturn an executive order per se, but they can pass legislation that essentially invalidates an executive order. The courts, as we've seen, can put a temporary pause or overturn executive orders.
Right. Okay. So that is a big thing to understand, because I think, Hatsy, when you understand that trajectory, it kind of helps you navigate that away from that fear. You can kind of understand then what the process is going to be, right? So then let's talk about the OMB, because how does that factor in to these executive orders?
Well, OMB is an agency like Department of Education or EPA, but it's the largest agency within the executive branch. And it's essentially the conductor or the liaison to all the other agencies, and essentially screens what's coming out of the White House, for instance. It's sort of the clearinghouse for the other agencies. So currently it's OMB that is saying to the agencies, please review, take this directive and review how it applies to the work that you're doing. OMB also sets the standards for how agencies administer the federal money that they pass out to governments, local and state, as well as to nonprofits.
Interesting. So the Office of Management and Budget, I think a lot of us just see it or think about this at like a certain time of the year when they're talking about the budgeting or overrides. I love that you helped educate us as to what's going on. And I never knew the level of impact that it had through an administration. This is pretty heady stuff, isn't it?
And of course, it's in their name. They monitor the budget. They help facilitate pulling the annual budget together. But another piece of their role is that sort of liaison to all the other agencies.
Wow. So thank you. So now we got to talk about this, and I'm going to call it out, this crazy shift. I mean, every single episode that we've had since inauguration has had some factor coming into this, whether it's international aid, whether it's, a local small animal welfare group, in rural America. Everybody's being impacted. And you're talking to us about, I think you're empowering us by saying we can communicate with a federal agency as opposed to waiting for them to talk to us. So help me understand what this looks like.
Oh, absolutely. Well, federal agencies are made up of federal employees. They're staffed by federal employees, and their jobs are to administer the programs that Congress has enabled through legislation. So they want to hear from you. If you've got questions, you deal with them initially when you apply, submit proposals to do work for them, whether you're a state or a nonprofit. And it's people in the federal government that make the decisions about which proposals to accept and so forth. And then, the the award documents come, they're full of legalese, they may be confusing to read. The program officers and financial officers are there to answer your questions about what they mean by the language in those agreements. So don't assume and wait to hear from them. They'd rather you get in touch with them first and be proactive about knowing what they expect.
Okay, so I got to woman up and say, I know you live, you were raised in the DC area, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Both your parents worked for the federal government. I feel like you're at the seat of where these decisions are being made. So many of us don't have access to that, or it's like, it seems to be like very much otherworldly, right? I think the natural inclination is, oh, it's the federal government. There's nobody to call. How do you do this? And so I find it fascinating that that's like one of your starting points is to talk about this communication aspect.
Mm-hmm. Of course. And that information is in the award documents themselves. If you're getting money or if you're considering and applying there, that contact information is right there. And it's there because they want to hear from you. And it's their job. Not only is it their job, but most of those people they're there because they want to help. They believe in the mission of the agency and the work they're doing. So don't be afraid. It's not a black mark of any kind to call them up. That's how I learned a lot of what I learned. Is I wasn't afraid to admit that I didn't know something, so I called up and I learned. And over the years, that's how I built my own expertise.
Well, I love that you give us permission to do that. And I also love how you explained it, because I think that in anything, when you don't communicate, then you end up trying to solve a problem that could have probably been avoided or never even become a problem, right? If you'd started to talk about it. So I think that's very, very wise. This leads into that next part. And you mentioned this, there's a lot of legalese. We're talking about contracts and trying to figure out options. Is this something that the government agency will help you with, or do you need to understand and get assistance on this contracting, especially if you weren't a part of it, right? And you work for an organization that's dealing with it. Where do you get this help and assistance? Do you need to find an attorney, or do you go straight back to that program officer with the government?
I always go back to the government, the program officers. Again, that's their job. And their agreements, contracts to some extent. So yes, they have to use certain terminology, but never assume that if you've got questions, don't assume one way or the other. Ask those questions, because it's better to know up front and head off problems than to have the agency come back, 3 years into an award and say, oh my gosh, you've been sending us the wrong kinds of reports, or whatever the issue is. So, and you're also not locked into perhaps the original budget or even the original way you put together the program. You can make changes over the course of an award if the current environment requires those changes. So again, it's the program officers are there at the agencies to help you do the work that they've asked you to do through this federal award. So don't ever be afraid to talk to someone in a government agency. They're happy to hear from you.
I'm like astonished that you just said that, because it seems to me like, these changes, I mean, if you just back it up to COVID, think of all the different things in our contracting and our funding that had to shift because we couldn't perform our programming, or our programming's needs changed. I mean, so it's not just catastrophic situations that allow for an option change, or is it more that that's the case in your experience?
Right. Sometimes you made plans to get certain supplies from a certain vendor, and that vendor is no longer available for different reasons. So you may need to buy it elsewhere, and that changes the timing of the performance. Any kind of issue like that can change. A lot can change over the course of even just a 1-year award. So it's important to develop a relationship with the people at the agencies because they're there to essentially partner with you to get this work done. And budgets sometimes need to change. You and I have talked about NICRAs in the past, negotiated indirect cost rates. Those can change in an agency for a lot of different reasons. And if an organization sees that their indirect cost rate is changing significantly, that's a time to call up the finance officer at the agency and say, here's what's happening. Could we do a budget modification before the end of the period? Things like that. So again, don't be afraid to talk to the government. Now, I will add that these days, many federal employees are under great stress and overextended. So be patient with them because they want to help, but they're fewer in numbers as time progresses, and also dealing with a lot of the same questions that you and I are discussing.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You know, Hatsy, before we move on, this kind of cements this concept that I know we all believe, but we don't always practice it. And that is that you establish relationships in good times so that they're there for the bad times, right? It's when something is a problem is not the time to start a relationship, right? You want to have created that connection at some
Right.
point,
That's
right?
the ideal. That's the ideal, but don't put it off. If you need their help now, don't hesitate to reach out. I would say.
So now let's move into advocacy. This is like one of those things that's so foreign to a lot of nonprofits. And you advise us to advocate for our nonprofit. If we are having issues or times of change, what does that look like to you?
Well, some nonprofits, as you know, are in the business of advocacy.
Mhm.
But if your organization is not, there's no time like the present to get involved, join your state's member of the National Council of Nonprofits. That organization is out there to advocate on behalf of all nonprofits, not just 501c3s, all types of nonprofits. And then that organization has state chapters, essentially. You can go to the National Council of Nonprofits website. They've got a map. You can click on your state and find the contact information for their member. But there are also many other more localized groups that advocate. Don't be shy about getting involved with them. And I know maybe I'm jumping the gun, but don't be shy about reaching out to your legislators, both at the local and national level.
Yeah. I think that's important. And I think that's like a real fear for so many organizations because, there's a myth that if you advocate or you engage in any policy work, you can lose your status. And so I think that that's like one of those things that is something you need to understand
Mm-hmm.
and to advocate. And I would ask you about that. Like, what do you see in along those lines?
I'm not an expert in lobbying and the lobbying limits, but there's a difference between advocacy and lobbying. Lobbying usually has to do with specific legislation, but advocacy can be as simple as calling your legislator or participating in the National Council of Nonprofits survey and just letting them know how the current situation is affecting your work, your ability to do that work, and what you'd like to see change. And you don't have to be specific about a particular piece of legislation or even an executive order, but just let them know what's happening to you so that they can, weigh those factors as they make decisions going forward.
I'm got a follow-up question to that. And I would wonder, I think that there are a lot of per sector kind of support groups or, if you will, associations, trade groups, that a lot of us don't always join because they can be more expensive. And we think, oh, well, I don't need to join that because they're dealing with Washington or, and I'm in Iowa. I mean, you know what I'm saying? And it seems to me like this would be that time to lean into whatever your sector looks like, right? I mean, do you see
Right.
that as something?
Yeah, and it doesn't have to cost anything. Many of these, especially the National Council of Nonprofit members, have a sign up for a free newsletter right on the landing page of their websites. So start there and see if they're providing good information. And if you like what you see, then call them up and see what what would be the benefits of joining. But certainly now, it puts you in touch with other members of the community, that the other members in your sector as well. And that too is another great way of advocating and working collectively toward a common goal. So, and there's strength in numbers and sometimes peace in numbers. So talking to others that are going through many of the same situations and issues can sometimes not just make you feel better, but give you some great ideas for what to do going forward.
Before I got on the nonprofit show, I was chatting with an executive director of a statewide organization, literally, and I had to end the call because I had to get on to you. And we were talking about coming up with a one sheet that had very precise metric points and data sets about what their work was and how important it was, so that they could disseminate this to their board, their stakeholders, their employees. They could have it on tours. They could put it on their website. They could leak it out through their social media and in all manner of content, management. Because she made the comment to me, she's like, I don't think that people understand how important we are, in this field. And I said, well, let's figure out how we communicate that, right? Because there's just so much chaos and there's so much unsettling. Where do we choose to pick our battles, right? And I'm wondering if you're seeing that this is leaking into communications. We talked about communicating with the agencies that we're working with, but what about the general public so that we can be advocates for what's going on?
Well, I think it's a good time to do that if you haven't, because there's a lot of misunderstanding or just not a lot of awareness sometimes of how much of what goes on in our communities, how much of that work is done by nonprofits. Your local hospital might be a nonprofit that's impacted. If you live in a college town, the local university may be a nonprofit, as well as the local food bank or the environmental group down the road. All of those could be impacted and are doing great work in the community and may be impacted even if they're not receiving federal funding directly. If they're receiving funding from state or local sources, the change in the way the feds are giving out money or not, as the case may be, could have an impact on the availability of both state and local funding. So if your group is relying on those sources, look ahead, do some scenario planning and get ready for, what might happen.
I love that you brought that up, because I can start to hear these smaller nonprofits saying, oh, well, that's not going to impact us because we don't do, federal contracting. And I loved what you said, because whether you do or not, it filters down. It does impact you in some form or fashion. And especially just even with the labor shift, that's going to majorly shift how we engage with our government representatives. I would imagine even these programs, like you said, these people, that have been working with these contracts have got to be under tremendous duress, because they're looking at their jobs and their job pool shrinking, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So sometimes although we're hearing from, we're talking to our clients all the time, of course, and we're hearing that sometimes they're experiencing delays in reaching the people they need to meet at the agencies, but there's always someone that does follow up. No one's been left completely stranded.
Good. That's good. That's great to know. And, but I also think it harkens back to what you said. Man, it's all about the relationship. If you're on a call list with 50 other people, but they can identify you or your organization, you might just move up a little on that list.
Jump the
right?
queue, right? Exactly.
Yeah, very interesting. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I really appreciate you coming on. YPTC has always been at the forefront with the nonprofit show. when there have been shifts of information and policy and on the federal level. And I thought that was really just something that was an issue during COVID, when literally your CEO, Jen Leva, would like be with her phone talking to us about what legislation was, passing or not. And so I feel like we're kind of in that same time.
Mhm.
And you all have been really great at being at the forefront of these changes and helping us to understand. Um, YPTC does a lot of educational pieces. You do webinars, you do thought narrative, pieces on your website. How do you expect to be communicating yourself with these changes?
Well, as you mentioned, we're doing webinars. Derek Dreyer and I are collaborating on a webinar later this month, in fact, to discuss some of what you and I have covered, demystifying the way government works and how nonprofits work with the federal government. We're probably going to do some more technical topics down the road as well. But we're blogging, of course. We've been on the accounting podcast recently, and we're beginning to be asked to speak to a number of different groups about not only how to demystify the way the system works, but how to cope, how to find strategies. And so we're also developing some updated programming on scenario analysis and planning.
I love it. Well, we need your help. We need your thought leadership. This is not a one and done. This is, as they say in the news, a moving story. And it's going to be something that has ramifications for a long, long time. Harriet Hatsy Cutshall, a director over at YPTC, focused in on government awards management. And what a great mind in helping our nonprofits across this country. It's been such a privilege to get to know you. And I'm very proud of you to see how you've grown with your organization and how you really have become an integral partner for so many of us. It's just amazing. Hatsy mentioned a lot of the outreach that YPTC is doing. They're always doing outreach, but especially now in these chaotic times. So I encourage you to go to their website, yptc.com, and you can look at what they're doing. They also have a very active presence on LinkedIn, where they're always doing a lot of posting. And I find that there's some great information that's like immediate, like just, literally this just happened. So check them out for that update and for that information, because we're all going to be needing to arm ourselves with this information. And if nothing else, we need those calm voices to kind of talk us off the ledge when the chaos seems to be so disruptive that it impinges the way we can navigate our nonprofits. So again, Hatsy Cutshall, what a pleasure to have you back on the Nonprofit Show.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine, Julia.
It's been a lot of fun. We have these amazing partners, and Hatsy's one of the originals. You're the OG from Your Part-Time Controller, but we also have partners with Bloomerang, American Nonprofit Academy, Staffing Boutique, JMT Consulting, Third Sector Company, and Fundraisers Friday. These are the folks that align with us in our sector. Hatsy, we're coming up on 1,300 episodes, and we're starting our 6th year next week.
Congratulations. That's remarkable.
Yeah, I was a blonde when we started. I'm just saying. This process has aged me. But anyway.
You've done a terrific job.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Hey, everybody, we end each and every episode with this mantra. And today I'm thinking like mental health. And the mantra is this, and we said it from the very beginning, from our very first episodes. And it goes like this: to stay well so you can do well. Thanks, Hatsy.